You've walked past it more times than you can count. It stands in the center of city squares, etched into the logos of corporations, built into the very monuments meant to stir our memory. In Mecca, millions circle it in devotion. In Berlin, thousands of stone cubes stretch like silent witnesses across a memorial field. And on your own desk, it might rest in miniature, disguised as a paperweight or a polished block of obsidian. The cube is everywhere, ordinary, familiar, unremarkable. And yet, once you begin to look closer, a strange realization dawns. This simple shape is not simple at all. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries carried it forward with reverence. Philosophers, architects, and mystics alike treated it as more than geometry. The cube was never just a shape. It was a symbol, a vessel of meaning, a container of mysteries that most people never pause to notice. That is the paradox. You have seen it thousands of times, but have you ever truly seen it? The cube hides in plain sight, and because it hides so well, we forget to ask what it really means. Tonight, we step into that question. What is the Black Cube, and why has it followed humanity from the temples of Mesopotamia to the towers of our modern cities? Once you understand its story, you may never look at the world around you the same way again. When you look up at the night sky, most of the planets seem restless. They dart across the heavens like quicksilver, shifting from one constellation to the next, as if they can't sit still. But Saturn is different. It moves with a gravity all its own, slow, deliberate, taking nearly 30 years to complete a single journey around the Sun. Ancient skywatchers noticed this pace immediately. They called it the Slow Wanderer, a planet that refused to hurry. For them, Saturn's rhythm wasn't just an astronomical curiosity, it was a mirror of a universal principle: structure, time, and authority. In the dusty lands of Mesopotamia, Saturn appeared in their myths as Ninurta, a deity who ruled over both war and agriculture, judgment and renewal. At first glance that seems contradictory. War destroys, farming nurtures, but in truth, they are two sides of the same law. Before seeds can be planted, the field has to be cleared. Before new life emerges, something old has to be cut away. Saturn carried that message: no growth without discipline, no order without boundaries. The Babylonians deepened this story. They named Saturn Kamanu, the steady one. They tracked its movements with almost obsessive precision, believing that when Saturn crossed into a new constellation, entire civilizations would feel the weight of change. And history, as they recorded it, seemed to prove them right. Empires rose and fell under its steady gaze. What looked like superstition to us today was, for them, the clear recognition of patterns too large to ignore. The Greeks gave us perhaps the most haunting version of the myth. They called him Kronos, the titan who devoured his own children to avoid being overthrown. It's a terrifying image, yet it contains one of the most profound insights about life itself. Time consumes everything. It creates. Every generation replaces the one before it. Every moment is swallowed by the next. Kronos was not just a monster, he was a truth-teller, embodying the merciless nature of time. And yet the Romans saw another face of Saturn. For them, he presided over the Golden Age, a mythical era of peace and plenty, when humanity wanted for nothing. But here lies the paradox. In times of total comfort, people stop evolving. Without challenge, there is no growth. Without resistance, there is no strength. Saturn's gift was not endless ease, but the creative pressure that forces the soul to mature. Astrologers came to call him the Great Malefic, not because he was evil, but because his lessons rarely come wrapped in joy. Saturn doesn't give you what you want, when you want it. He withholds, he delays, he tests. He is the stern father who refuses to hand you the answers until you've done the work yourself. He knows that too much too soon will weaken you, and so he makes you wait. And then, once every 29 years or so, Saturn comes home. It returns to the exact spot in the heavens it occupied when you were born. These moments, known as Saturn Returns, mark some of the most decisive chapters of human life. At 29, many people feel a sudden urge to make hard choices, to leave a dead-end job, to marry, to divorce, to move, to finally step into adulthood with seriousness. Around 58, another return often brings a deep reckoning. What have you built? What have you neglected? What must change if you're to live the rest of your years with integrity? Each return is like a final exam for the soul. Pass, and you move to a higher grade. Resist, and the same lessons will circle back until you face them. This is why, across cultures and centuries, Saturn has always commanded respect. It is not the planet of ease, it is the planet of necessity. Its slow orbit reminds us that real growth takes time. Its myths remind us that life is both fragile and resilient, and its cycles remind us that we cannot escape the discipline of time, but we can learn to work with it, even master it. Saturn may be called the slow wanderer, but in truth, it is the great teacher walking beside us through every season of life, showing us that boundaries are not our enemy, but the very framework within which we become who we are meant to be. Geometry has always been more than numbers scratched on parchment. To the ancients, it was the handwriting of the universe, a silent code that shaped not only temples and monuments, but the very structure of consciousness itself. They understood something we often forget. Every shape carries a frequency, and every frequency has the power to program the mind. Geometry is not cold mathematics, it is metaphysics in motion. Among all these sacred forms, two stand in stark contrast: the circle and the cube. The circle whispers of infinity, no beginning and no end, the pure flow of potential. It represents everything unbounded, eternal, and fluid. The cube, by contrast, is finite, rigid, precise, 6 faces, 12 edges, 8 corners, everything contained, everything measurable. The cube is matter nailed down, spirit compressed into structure. It is the form of limitation itself. But here is where the story takes a revelatory turn. When the ancients unfolded the cube, laying it flat, they discovered another symbol hidden inside its geometry: the cross. To them, this was not coincidence, it was encoded wisdom, showing that from the cube of matter comes the cross of suffering and, ultimately, redemption. Existence within physical reality guarantees struggle, but struggle is not punishment. It is the condition of growth. The cross is not merely a Christian emblem, it is the inevitable shape life takes when infinite consciousness chooses to experience itself through finite form. This truth reverberates through multiple traditions. In the Kabbalistic tree of life, the cube corresponds to Malkuth, the kingdom, the final sphere where all higher energies crystallize into matter. Malkuth is the realm of grounding, stability, survival, but also of decay and limitation. It is the spiritual plane made tangible, where ideas harden into reality. In Eastern thought, the same principle emerges in the root chakra, Muladhara. At the base of the spine, it is the center of physical security, the part of us that clings to food, shelter, safety, the basics of survival. The cube lives there too, anchoring us to earth, but often chaining us with fear. Seen this way, limitation is not the enemy of spirit. It is its necessary framework. A river flows powerfully only when confined by banks. A seed becomes a tree only by pressing against the resistance of soil, and consciousness becomes wise only when time and structure hem it in. Suffering, then, is not arbitrary cruelty, inflicted by some distant cosmos. It is the friction required to awaken depth, to turn raw potential into lived experience. This is the hidden promise of the cube, to cross transformation. That pain and pressure are not signals of abandonment, but invitations to maturity. To unfold the cube is to see that our very struggles are built into the geometry of life, not to crush us, but to carve us into something capable of transcendence. And just as the cube can fold back upon itself, returning to form, so too can we, through awareness, transform our crosses of suffering back into structures of strength. The ancients looked at these shapes not as abstractions, but as mirrors of the human journey. Infinity longs for form. Forme crée limitation. Limitation generates struggle, and struggle, embraced with wisdom, becomes the path to awakening. The cube and the cross together tell this story, that the architecture of existence is both prison and promise, and within the very lines that bind us lies the map to our own liberation. There is something about the color black that stirs unease. It is the color of the unknown, of night and mystery, but also the color of potential, like fertile soil waiting for the seed, or the cosmic void before creation began. When the cube turns black, it becomes more than structure. It becomes shadow, and in that shadow lies both fear and transformation. In the language of alchemy, this stage is called nigredo, the blackening. It is the descent into matter, the breaking down of what was once whole. To the alchemists, this phase wasn't failure, it was the beginning of renewal. Before gold could be formed, base metals had to be dissolved. Before enlightenment could dawn, the soul had to confront its darkness. The Black Cube embodies that principle. It is the place where everything solid is stripped, where the ego faces its own mortality, where illusions so truth can live. This is why mystics often describe the material world as both prison and temple. To the unconscious, the Black Cube feels suffocating, a box of iron walls closing in. It is routine, conformity, gravity, everything that makes us feel trapped. But to the awakened, the same cube reveals itself as a chamber of initiation, a sacred container in which the soul can be tested and refined. The prison and the temple are not two different places. They are the same space, experienced differently depending on the state of one's awareness. The Gnostics warned of the cube as a prison, crafted by the demiurge to trap the soul in matter, and yet even they admitted it could become a training ground if consciousness woke up inside it. Modern psychologists echo this wisdom. Jung spoke of the shadow as the hidden aspects of the self fears, désir, wounds that must be integrated rather than denied. The cube mirrors that shadow. Ignore it, and it dominates you. Face it, and it becomes your ally. So the question is not whether the cube is good or evil. The question is, who holds the key? Do you let the cube dictate your life, its routines, its imposed walls, its collective structures, or do you step into it consciously, treating each limitation as a lesson, each boundary as a doorway? The cube is not out to destroy you. It waits, like a stern teacher, to see whether you will finally recognize it for what it is. The crucible of transformation. That is the tension the Black Cube awakens in us. Fear and hope, despair and possibility, all wrapped into a single form. You can recoil from it and feel trapped forever, or you can walk into it with eyes open and discover that within its dark walls lies the light of your becoming. Long before modern astronomy sent probes to the edge of Saturn's rings, ancient civilizations were already building monuments to its power. They did not have telescopes or satellites, yet somehow they sensed that this slow, distant planet carried a weight that shaped both the heavens and human destiny. And so, across continents and centuries, they raised their cities of stone in its image. In Mesopotamia, the land historians often call the cradle of civilization, temples rose in stepped layers known as ziggurats. These were not random piles of bricks. Their cubic measurements were carefully chosen, echoing the rhythms of Saturn's orbit. To the Babylonians, these structures functioned like cosmic batteries, anchoring divine principles into the earthly realm. Each step lifted the worshipper closer to the heavens, yet each stone reminded them of the discipline and order Saturn demanded. Egypt carried the vision further. The Great Pyramid itself can be read as a Saturnian design. Its geometry aligns with celestial cycles, its proportions reflecting a harmony of earth and sky. To the priests of Egypt, the pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a machine for transformation, channeling cosmic energies into the soul's passage. They saw the cube not merely as solid matter, but as a vessel of Saturnian magic, an instrument for bending time and consciousness toward eternity. The Phoenicians, great travelers of the ancient seas, passed fragments of this wisdom into the cultures they touched. When their language flowed into Hebrew, the word El, one of the ancient names linked to Saturn, took root. In Jewish tradition, the seventh day became the Sabbath, Saturn's day, a time of rest and realignment. This was no coincidence. To pause every seventh day was to honor Saturn's rhythm, to step out of the rush of life and return to balance. The cube appeared not only in temples, but in time itself. The Romans made Saturn a household name. His temple stood at the heart of the Forum, his image tied to the Golden Age they longed to revive. But the most striking Saturnian ritual came each December, Saturnalia. For a brief period, the social order flipped. Slaves dined with masters, rules dissolved into revelry, and chaos reigned. To outsiders, it looked like indulgence. To the Romans, it was controlled chaos, a pressure valve that allowed society to reset before the grind of structure resumed. Saturn was still teaching, order without release becomes tyranny. But release without order becomes ruin. The balance of the two is what keeps civilization alive. What becomes clear is that these monuments and rituals were not decorative, not accidents of culture. They were sacred technologies. The ziggurat, the pyramid, the Sabbath, the Saturnalia, all were ways of tuning human life to cosmic law. The ancients did not see Saturn as a distant rock circling the sun. They experienced it as a presence that demanded respect, discipline, and alignment. And in return, it offered stability, longevity, and wisdom. The cube, for them, was not just a shape. It was a bridge, a way to carry the weight of Saturn's lessons into the world of stone and time. And every time we walk past a pyramid, study a ziggurat, or even mark a weekend of rest, we are still, in some quiet way, living in the architecture Saturn left behind. If the ancients carved their reverence into stone, our modern world has etched the cube into steel, glass, and concrete. We pass by it every day, rarely noticing how deeply it shapes our environment. Yet once you start looking, the cube is everywhere on our screens, in our skylines, even in the rhythm of our cities. And when you see it, really see it, you can't help but feel a chill. Consider the Kaaba in Mecca, a massive black cube around which millions of people circle in endless devotion. Whatever one's faith, the sight is powerful. Humanity itself becomes a spiral of living energy around a central form. The geometry directs the body and, in turn, directs the mind. That same principle echoes across the modern world in ways far less sacred. In Manhattan stands the Alamo Cube, a giant steel block that rotates with a push, as if to remind us consciously or not that the cube is not fixed, but in constant negotiation with those who move it. In Melbourne, Berlin, and dozens of other cities, do you find memorials made of stark cubic blocks, some numbering in the thousands? The Berlin Holocaust Memorial, for instance, is a forest of grey stone slabs, each one a cube or rectangular prism, stretching like a field of silent weights. Walking through it, you feel the heaviness, the gravity of history, the inescapable sense of karmic debt. These cubes are not decorative. They are designed to impress themselves onto your psyche. And then there are the corporate logos, the digital temples of our age, Microsoft's four-colored window, bank emblems, tech company marks, all echoing the cube or its fragments. To most, these are harmless brand designs, but to the subconscious, shapes matter. A square signals stability, authority, control. Multiply that effect across billions of people staring at screens, and suddenly the cube becomes a silent language guiding our sense of trust, obedience, even dependency. We don't question it because it looks familiar, but that familiarity is precisely the point. Architecture joined the chorus in the 20th century. The Bauhaus movement championed cubic minimalism, clean lines, flat surface, rational grids. The style spread across the world, and today, entire skylines are composed of cubes stacked upon cubes. These structures may look neutral, but they also condition us to conformity. Step into a modern office tower, and you feel it, the cubicles, the glass squares, the sense that human beings are meant to fit neatly inside geometric boxes. And now, in the 21st century, the cube has gone digital. Smart city, promise efficiency. But they also extend surveillance into every corner of life. Grids of sensors, data centers, and algorithms form a new kind of cube, a digital lattice that monitors movement, records behavior, and predicts choices. It is the cube without walls, invisible yet everywhere. To live inside such systems is to be shaped by them, even if you never think about it. What ties all of this together? The Kaaba, the Alamo Cube, corporate logos, Bauhaus buildings, smart cities, memorials, is that the cube still works as a kind of sacred technology. It shapes behavior not by force, but by environment. It whispers to the subconscious, stay inside the lines, follow the structure, accept the weight. And while some of these cubes inspire reverence or remembrance, others quietly enforce conformity. This is why noticing matters. Once you recognize how deeply the cube saturates modern life, you begin to ask new questions. Who decides the shape of the spaces we move through? Who benefits from grids that confine, from logos that reassure? From memorials that weigh down the collective memory, the cube has never been just a shape. It is an instrument of influence, a silent architect of the collective mind, and if we are not aware, we risk living our entire lives inside boxes we never chose, yet unconsciously obey. For thousands of years, long after empires rose and fell, secret schools carried fragments of wisdom forward in whispers and symbols. Their teachings were not written in plain words but carved into ritual, geometry, and allegory. And again, the cube appeared. This time, not as a prison, but as a promise. In Freemasonry, initiates are taught that every human being begins as a rough ashlar, an uncut stone with sharp edges and imperfections. Through discipline, study, and moral labor, that stone can be shaped into the perfect ashlar, a smooth cube that fits seamlessly into the architecture of a greater temple. This is not merely a lesson in craftsmanship, it is a metaphor for the soul. Life itself is the chisel, and every trial carves us closer to alignment. The cube becomes the image of completion, the evidence that chaos can be shaped into order through patience and inner work. Alchemy carried the same message in a different language. The alchemists spoke of turning lead into gold, but they knew the metals in their crucibles mirrored the states of the human spirit. Nigredo, the blackening stage, was descent into shadow, the necessary breakdown. But after dissolution came purification, and after purification came transmutation. The philosopher's stone, the golden state, was not a mineral prize but a spiritual transformation. Here too, the cube was present, the container of the work, the chamber where base matter was stripped of illusion so that essence could shine. Kabbalistic traditions offered yet another perspective. On the tree of life, the sphere of Bina understanding was sometimes envisioned as the cube of form, the structure that allows higher wisdom to crystallize. Ceremonial magicians drew upon this imagery, using the cube as a launching pad for ascent. To stand within a cube in ritual was to place oneself in the very center of order, aligning body and mind with the framework of the cosmos. Even in the tarot, the cube appears, hidden, in plain sight. On the devil card, two figures are chained to a cubic pedestal, slaves to matter, blind to their freedom. In the tower, lightning shatters the cube of false security, forcing a collapse that makes room for truth. And in the world card, the final arc of liberation, the cube is mastered, transcended, integrated. The cards tell a story: first bondage, then disruption, then mastery. The cube is the stage on which the human drama unfolds. Modern psychology, though stripped of mystic language, repeats the same insight. Carl Jung spoke of shadow work, the confrontation with the parts of ourselves we deny or repress. Until we face them, we remain trapped in cycles we don't understand. But when we step into the shadow, when we integrate rather than run, we discover strength we never knew we had. The inner cube is this very container, the boundaries of the psyche where conflict becomes coherence. The mystery schools were never about escaping life. They were about engaging it more deeply. They taught that the cube you fear can become the cube you master. That discipline and shadow, pain and limitation, are not enemies, but sculptors, and that when the work is done, the rough stone becomes the perfect cube, a soul in harmony with itself, and with the architecture of the universe. When NASA's Cassini spacecraft slipped into orbit around Saturn in 2004, most scientists expected photographs of rings and moons, measurements of density, and perhaps a few surprises about atmosphere. What they did not expect was music. The instruments picked up structured radio emissions patterns in the electromagnetic spectrum that pulsed and shifted like songs too vast for human ears. Saturn, it seemed, was not just a planet. It was broadcasting, and the planet's geometry sang too. At the North Pole of Saturn rages a storm that has lasted for decades, maybe centuries. A vast hexagon, 6 perfect sides of swirling gas, each the size of a continent. No one can fully explain why it holds its shape, unmoved by time, unbroken by chaos. To the ancients, this would not have been a puzzle, but a revelation, a cosmic antenna fixed at the crown of the slow wanderer, beaming order into a universe of flux. Modern researchers speak of entrainment, the way biological rhythms sync to external frequencies. Our brains, our hearts, even our cells, respond to patterns of vibration, the beat of a drum, the rhythm of waves, the flicker of light. All can entrain the body, shifting its state. Extend that principle outward, and you begin to wonder, if Saturn broadcasts frequencies, and if the moon acts as a reflector, what does Earth receive? What patterns hum in the background of our consciousness, unnoticed but powerful, shaping the tempo of our collective life? For millennia, traditions intuited this connection. They spoke of celestial spheres as choirs, planets as tones in a grand harmony. Saturn, the lowest and slowest, was the bass note, grounding the cosmic chord. Now science begins to stumble upon the same truth with antennas and spectrograms. The divide between myth and measurement grows thinner with every discovery, but there is a shadow side to this awareness. In the modern age, we are surrounded not only by natural frequencies, but by artificial ones. Wi-Fi routers, cell towers, screens, satellites, all pouring electromagnetic signals into our nervous systems. Unlike Saturn's steady pulse, these fields are jagged, constant, often chaotic. Many feel the result as anxiety, insomnia, spiritual numbness. The body loses track of its original rhythm, entrained not to cosmic order, but to man-made noise. This is why ancient practices matter more than ever. Meditation quiets the static, letting the nervous system reset. Breathwork restores coherence between heart and mind. Sound healing through chanting, bowls, or even a single sustained note tunes the body back to natural harmonics. Grounding, walking barefoot on the earth, reconnects us with the planet's own Schumann resonance, the pulse of life itself. These are not superstitions, but technologies of frequency sovereignty, ways to choose what you entrain to, the ways to decide which broadcast will shape your being. Saturn will continue to sing its slow, solemn notte. The hexagon storm will continue to spin. The question is whether we will hear it beneath the static, and whether we will learn to tune ourselves back to the music of a cosmos that has been playing long before we arrived. Awe and concern both rise here. Awe at the grandeur of a planet that hums like an ancient bell, concern that we may drown its song in our own noise, and yet the choice is still ours. Which frequency will you follow? For all the talk of temples and planets, the most powerful cube is not built of stone or orbiting in the sky. It is built inside each of us. Every human being carries an inner cube, the architecture of the ego. It is the structure that gives us identity, that protects us from being overwhelmed by chaos, and that also limits us when its walls grow too thick. To understand Saturn's cube out there, we must first understand the one within. The ego begins as scaffolding. As children, we construct a sense of self, brick by brick. I am this, not that. I belong here, not there. I like these people. I fear those. Each wall offers stability. Without it, we would dissolve into confusion. But soon, the cube becomes more than structure. It becomes a fortress. We fill it with defenses: denial, when something is too painful; projection, when we cannot face our own flaws; rationalization, when reality cuts against our story. These defenses guard us, but they also imprison us. The same cube that keeps us safe can become the box we never leave. And it is not only personal. Entire societies build collective cubes. Walk into a corporate office, and you see it literally. Cubicles lined in rows, screens set at the same height, routines synchronized like gears in a machine. But the conformity runs deeper than furniture. It tells you when to speak, how to dress, what ambitions are acceptable. Schools, corporations, governments, each builds its own cube of norms. Live inside long enough, and you stop asking if you chose the walls, or if they were chosen for you. Yet there is no need to demonize the cube. Just as Saturn is not only malefic, but also teacher, the ego is not only prison, but also necessary foundation. Without ego, we cannot function. Without defenses, we cannot survive. The point is not to shatter the cube, but to renovate it, to turn its heavy walls into windows. That is the work of therapy, of meditation, of shadow integration. Instead of denying the parts of ourselves we fear, we invite them into the light. Instead of projecting blame outward, we reclaim our power inward. Each act of awareness is like chiseling away stone, reshaping the cube from confinement into container. Jung called this the process of individuation, the integration of shadow into a more complete self. Spiritual traditions across the world echo the same insight. You do not transcend by escaping ego. You transcend by stabilizing it, by making it strong enough to hold what is larger. An unstable cube collapses under pressure. A renovated cube becomes a temple. So the question is not whether you have an ego cube. You do. The real question is, how are you living inside it? Are its defense choking your growth? Or are they being slowly reshaped into pillars of strength? The walls can be opaque, keeping you in darkness. Or they can be carved into windows, letting light pour through. The difference lies not in the structure itself, but in your consciousness of it. When we understand this, empathy rises for ourselves and for others. Everyone you meet is walking around in their own cube, built from fears, hopes, habits, and wounds. Some are cramped and rigid, some are expansive and open, and all of us, in one way or another, are trying to turn our inner prisons into temples of understanding. Every tradition worth its salt has warned against the temptation to escape too quickly. The impulse is natural when the cube feels like a prison. Our first thought is to run, but the old mystics and the modern psychologists alike insist on something more radical. Liberation does not come from escape. It comes from transformation. You do not flee the cube. You turn it into a temple. This begins with acceptance, not passive resignation, but a conscious acknowledgement. This is where I am. These are the walls I have built. This is the weight I carry. Paradoxically, the moment you stop fighting against the cube begins to change. What once felt like an iron box starts to reveal itself as a container, something that can hold your growth rather than crush it. From there, practices open doors. Visualization invites you to imagine the cube around you and then breathe light into its walls, softening their rigidity. Breath itself becomes a chisel, steady and patient, carving space inside the structure. Sound, whether a chant, a note from a singing bowl, or even the resonance of your own voice, turns the cube into a chamber that vibrates with life. And surrender, that most difficult practice, teaches you to stop clinging to the illusion of control, to let the cube reshape itself as you reshape within it. When you begin to live this way, the symbols invert. Structure, once a prison, to becomes devotion, a framework within which you can build lasting meaning. Karma, once a chain of punishment, becomes a growth map, showing you precisely what lessons are left unfinished. Time, once an enemy devouring all, becomes a gift, stretching out long enough for you to practice, to stumble, to learn. And this transformation does not end with the individual. Awakening ripples outward. A person who has turned their prison into a temple carries a quiet gravity. Their presence shifts families, workplaces, communities. They don't need to preach. The architecture of their being does the work. Just as one cube resonates with another, the consciousness of one awakened soul begins to retune the collective field. The cube never leaves us. It is part of the human condition. But when we see it rightly, it becomes something entirely different. Its walls no longer close in, they rise up, like pillars. Its ceiling no longer smothers, it opens into sky. What was once confinement becomes sanctuary. What was once the site of despair becomes the ground of empowerment. This is the path the ancients tried to tell us in stone, in myth, in ritual. Not the path of flight, but of transformation. The cube is here, and it will always be here. The only question left is, will you remain its prisoner, or will you consecrate it into your temple? In the end, the cube is not just out there in temples of stone, in corporate logos, or even circling far away as the planet Saturn. It is within you. It is the architecture of your own consciousness, the structure that can either keep you asleep or help you awaken. For the unconscious mind, the cube feels like a prison, rigid, confining, unyielding. But for the awakened mind, the very same cube becomes a tool, a chamber where discipline and awareness refine the soul. This is Saturn's true gift. It is not here to crush you, but to temper you, the way fire tempers metal, the way time polishes stone. Saturn does not oppress it, refines, and when you begin to see the cube for what it is, its heavy walls no longer weigh you down. They hold you steady while you grow. So the invitation is simple. Look again at the structures around you and inside you. Ask yourself not only what they limit, but what they make possible. And if you've followed this journey, if you've seen how the cube hides in plain sight, yet carries a deeper truth, then claim it for yourself. Type in the comments, "I see beyond the cube," Let it be your declaration that you no longer mistake the prison for your fate, but recognize the temple hidden inside it, because once you see beyond the cube, you can never unsee it. And that vision, that solemn hope, is the beginning of your own transformation,